Welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I am your host for this spooky podcast. Welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I figured that in honor of the Halloween season, I would do a short podcast on Halloween monsters. These are the things that most people associate with this season, and I thought it might be a good idea to simply introduce you to the monsters of the Halloween holiday. Now, first of all, I'd like a shout out to Dragon Wings LLC for my hat. This is one of their witches' hats that lights up on the tip. Also to Valhalla Crafts for their bat lanterns. You can get them with purple lights or with white lights. And I want to just remind all of you that any additional material from this podcast will be available for paid subscribers on Substack and Patreon. Just look for Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. But now that I have you here, now gather round, gather closer, closer, closer. Now that I have you here, I'd like to introduce you to Halloween monsters. Now, Halloween, of course, October 31st. I imagine that many of you are preparing to give food, give candy, have all kinds of people come to your door. Hopefully they'll all be dressed up, and I hope you all will get into the spirit of the holiday. And I'm well aware that this is largely, and I say largely, an American holiday. When it comes to things like trick-or-treating and going door to door and decorating the house and dressing up, a lot of that is American traditions. When I was in Ireland in the 1990s, people had a tendency to make fun of Americans for how much we got into Halloween. And we've really gotten into Halloween for years. My grandmother, growing up in Hollywood in the early 1920s, she told me all kinds of stories of what they used to get up to for Halloween. They'd dress up, but they'd also egg people's houses. They would toilet paper people's houses. And keep in mind, this is in the 1920s and 30s. They would knock on people's doors and run away. I do not recommend that, particularly not these days. However, the celebration of Halloween, as we've come to acknowledge it in this country particularly, is one that is steeped in an awful lot of traditions that came to this country brought by immigrants. Yes, Halloween in many respects is the traditional and first immigrant holiday. It is the mix mash. It's not even so much a melting pot as it is salsa or a salad, where you can still get the flavor of individual pieces, and it's not all blended together into some kind of unrecognizable mush. But American culture has adapted and appropriated traditions from all over the world into its spooky season. First of all, when we talk about Halloween, what are we talking about? The word itself, Halloween, as I said in my Mischief short about the Green Man, Halloween derives from the word hallows, which means sacred, and the word eve, night before. Now, you might be thinking, well, what on earth? If you didn't catch my Mischief short, you absolutely should. But the day that we celebrate Halloween, October 31st, is actually the night before the actual holiday, which is November 1st. And the holiday itself has been celebrated for easily thousands of years. I won't go too far back in time because we don't have records that it was being celebrated in any great sense more than a couple thousand years ago. But we do know that people celebrated November 1st as the Feast of All Saints. In the Catholic Church, that was a day that was holy and a day of veneration for all the people who had given their lives as martyrs for the Christian faith. And all of those people, and there are hundreds of them. In fact, every day in the Catholic calendar has at least one saint's feast, if not multiple feast days on the same day. But November 1st is for all of them. November 1st is the Feast of All Saints. And another word for saint, another word for sacred, is hallowed. And of course, because these celebrations would start the night before, because that tradition goes all the way back pre-Christian observance, celebrating these feast days and holidays the night before. Because of that, Halloween, or the Feast of All Hallows, would start on the eve of All Hallows. And if you contract that, if you contract All Hallows Eve and squish it together, you get Halloween. That's where that word comes from. Now, I know that in a lot of modern popular culture and in a lot of particularly American political discourse, people want to associate Halloween with devils and satanic worship. Okay, there's a little bit of that. But really, by and large, it is actually a pagan festival that honors the god of the dead. In Irish, that's Samhain, and it's spelled Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. The Celtic Festival of the Dead, and I have a Bella-Bat cat here on the ground who apparently wants to join us. It's possible you'll get a black cat for this podcast. You get the Feast Day of the Dead. The god of the dead, Samhain, was venerated on November 1st. This is the period that marks the beginning of winter. Now, that ancient tradition, marking the beginning of winter and essentially the new year, after all of the fertility festivals, after all of the summer festivals, after all of the harvest festivals, would be that final turn of the year, turning of the wheel of the year. In modern Wicca and certain modern pagan observances, this is the new year. This is the New Year festival before the winter starts. That does have its origins in medieval culture because of the agrarian calendar and that whole process of following when you till your fields, when you plant your fields, when your fields start to sprout, when your animals give birth, when you have harvest, and then when you gather that harvest, and then the year itself turns again. So the feast day of the god of the dead, Samhain, in Irish, the new year after all the harvest festivals are done and everybody is preparing to hunker down for the winter, that became, in Catholicism, the day to celebrate all of those saints who'd been martyred. So Halloween starts, yes, as a pre-Christian or pagan observance that was then co-opted by Catholicism and turned into an extra holy day of observation and veneration for all the saints of the Catholic Church. Now, in modern popular society, in modern popular culture, people interpret Halloween in a variety of different ways. They either mark it as a religious observance for their non-Christian Wiccan faith, or they mark it as a day of Catholic observance. And of course, the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, is the day after All Saints. Because November 1st in the Catholic calendar is November 1st. That's All Saints. November 2nd is the Feast of All Souls, where you venerate everybody who has died, particularly your loved ones, your family. In Spanish-speaking countries that still have that Catholic observance, it mixes with a lot of indigenous traditions. So in Mexico, in countries of Central America and parts of South America, they celebrate Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, by celebrating their ancestors, their family. They leave out sugar skulls, calaveras. They leave out offerings of food and drink and brightly colored things to essentially entertain the dead who come back or visit their families and their loved ones to protect them and check up on them on that day. And in fact, the festival covers November 1st, November 2nd, November 3rd. The festival depends and varies in length depending where you are. But Halloween itself is part and parcel of that celebration. So while some cultures will celebrate it as Dia de los Muertos, others will celebrate it as Halloween. But in every instance, it is a day of celebration. It is a day of veneration. It is a day to stop and think about those who've passed before, and to think about our own blessings and our own bounty, and be grateful for everything we've had over the course of the year. Halloween, of course, the way we observe it in the United States, if you're going to get dressed up and go door to door, still has its roots and its tradition in the Middle Ages and in earlier societies. So, Halloween, Samhain, the Celtic New Year, the Irish God of the Dead, who appears in certain medieval literary texts like the Liber Gavala, and in other references to various holidays and observances. Medieval texts, medieval literature, remember folklore is different. Folklore is the oral tradition that is passed down from generation to generation, and it changes and it adapts. Literature and chronicle are what people actually wrote down. Sometimes they don't quite agree, or sometimes the folklore adapts from that medieval literary tradition. So as I said, Halloween, Samhain, November 1st, celebrated the night before as the New Year, that then runs into the Feast of All Souls, which is the feast day to venerate everybody who has passed. And you might wonder, well, how on earth does that get associated with scary movies and trick or treat? Part of it is because when immigrants came over to America, they brought aspects of their specific observance, their own traditions. Now, things like jack-o'-lanterns actually come from Ireland. And the jack of the lantern, as they were called, were originally carved from turnips. Now, Irish turnips are about this big, maybe about that big. And they would carve turnips and they put a candle in it. And they were meant to scare off evil spirits, but guide home good ones, guide home their family members who might return on those feast days of Catholic observance. Now, the door-to-door, there are a lot of traditional holidays where somebody shows up at your door. There are Christmas holidays where you see an awful lot of that. And I'll have an entire episode on the medieval Yuletide traditions. But this idea of something, an entity that knocks on your door and either asks for hospitality, either asks for food or drink, or if you deny it, creates mischief and havoc, that goes back to ancient stories all the way back to Greece and Rome, because gods used to show up at your door and they'd seek hospitality. Now, they didn't look like gods. You could never be certain 100% that it was a god knocking on your door, which is why you always offered hospitality, because you never know whether the entity knocking on your door has the capacity to treat you or to trick you. Now, the whole modern thing of going door to door for candy does evolve from Victorian traditions where kids would play tricks, where they'd get into mischief, and where they'd want something good to eat. candy, apple, something. Some of that goes back to much older tradition, the origins of which are somewhat lost in time. But you do want to be sure that if somebody knocks on your door, that you pay them respect and courtesy and give them a treat. Because if you don't, it's entirely likely that they will return with a trick. So, those are some of the traditions. When I was in Ireland in the 1990s, I was exceptionally lucky to go visit a friend of mine's family who lived on Inishmore on the Aran Islands. Now, those are the islands in the far west of Ireland off the coast of Galway and Connemara. And on Inishmore, the local language is Irish. People grow up speaking Irish first instead of English, and they learn English, but Irish is their first language. And some of the traditions are somewhat different. When we went to Inishmore for Halloween in 1997, we dressed to be completely unrecognizable. The idea was so that the puka, the goblins, the mischievous spirits, could not recognize you. You didn't want the puka to recognize you. So you might wear a mask or something that covered your face, and you didn't speak. Now, we improvised our costumes completely. We improvised because we hadn't planned anything. We went to basically the Spar, which is the large equivalent of a 7-Eleven on the island in Kilronan. And we got whatever we could. I mean, we had pillowcases that I dyed, and I wore trash bags as a suit. I'll put up a picture. It's amusing. But we went from pub to pub on the island, and we never said a word. Because on an island that small, with a population at the time of about 800, people would recognize you by your voice. And since you were trying to stop the puka from recognizing you, you wouldn't say a word. We went from pub to pub, and we would tap on the taps. And it was the only time a self-respecting Irish barman would give you a straw with your Guinness. Wearing a mask, you need a straw. And we'd go wandering the streets, wandering the roads in the dark, from pub to pub, not saying a word. You had to be careful, though, because sometimes people like to play tricks. Sometimes the lads would jump out at you, and if they thought you might be up for a tussle, they might give you a thumping. So it was always good to carry a stick. And my friend Valerie Nilarta carried a shillelagh with her, just in case. We never had any trouble. But at the end of the night, everybody had been to the pub. There was a dance. There was a ceilidh. And we would go in this big hall. Everyone's in their costumes. And there'd be dancing, traditional Irish reels, and all of those group dances. And everybody would dance until basically their costumes fell off of them and their identity was revealed. And there was no drink at the ceilidh. You'd done your drinking before you got there. And all of that was on Halloween night. So on the 31st until the early hours of the 1st. And then on the 1st and on the 2nd, people will go to their family graveyards and clean their family's graves and just tend things. But because it was the marker of that season, there are certain things that you said, we're not going to do anymore. If there were late season blackberries, don't eat them. Because if you eat them after November 1st, the pukas had pissed on them. That was the favorite saying. Don't eat them because the pukas have pissed on them. I mean, it's a graphic image, but it's a good thing to say don't eat late, possibly rotted fruit on the vine. So that was how we celebrated Halloween in 1997 in Inishmore. Now, in the city of Dublin, kids will still trick or treat. That was very much a thing for kids. There are other traditions immortalized in stories like James Joyce's The Dead. And that's part of his series, The Dubliners, that he wrote in the early 20th century, that he wrote about 1904, and they were published in 1914. And in the story, The Dead, they celebrate some of these folklore traditions by making a barmbrack. A barmbrack is a cake that's kind of like a fruit cake, but not quite. And in there were tokens. And if you got the wedding ring, it meant you were going to get married within the next year. I got the ring several times. I've never been married. Maybe you can't trust that barmbrack. But there was another game that's in Joyce's story, The Dead, where there would be saucers, one with earth, one with water, one with a ring, one with cloth. There's my Bella Bat. Bella has joined us. Say hello, Bella Bat. And you'd be blindfolded, and the person would have to choose in front of them the saucer. Now, if you got water, it meant you were going to cross the ocean in the next year. If you got the ring, it meant you were going to get married. There were significance and signifiers for all of the things on the saucers. Earth meant you were going to die. And so the whole story is about the older woman who gets earth when she plays the game. I'm going to be batted at here by the bat on my shoulder. The older woman who gets the earth on the dish, and nobody really wants to talk about it because it's meant to be foreshadowing death. It's an omen. Those stories carry weight. Those traditions carry weight. And of course, they all tie into our modern interpretations of Halloween. Now, as I said, ignore the bat on my shoulder who's going to play with my hat. And let's get into the idea of monsters. Now, what are monsters? You might think, bats on our shoulders. Those monsters with big, nasty, pointy fangs. Grr, arg, under your bed. The creatures that live in your closet. Trust me, I read Stephen King as a kid, and I slept with a nightlight for 2 years after reading Night Shift, and I still will not sleep with my closet door open. The idea of a monster, though, being something horrible and nasty and awful that's going to eat you or kill you, rip you to shreds, or do horrible things to you, it's not actually the medieval idea of monster. The etymology of the word monster, late Middle English, from French monstre, from Latin monstrum, means portent or omen, or it derives from monere, to warn. So in a lot of texts specifically, the appearance of a monster is not danger from the monster, but a warning or a portent about what might come from other quarters. And monsters, of course, could take a variety of forms in both folklore and tradition, oral tradition, religious observance, and literature. Some of the monsters might be things like shapeshifters, haints, spooks, marvels. A monster could be marvelous, something to revel at, something extraordinary that could be an omen or a portent of good things as much as negative things. Now, the contrast to that, the idea of monsters in medieval literature and medieval texts, something called cryptozoology. Now, cryptozoology, I'm sure several of you have actually heard this, and I'm the vice president of an academic society dedicated to the medieval study of cryptozoology. So, cryptozoology is a pseudoscience and subculture that searches for and studies unknown, legendary, or extinct animals whose present existence is disputed or unsubstantiated, particularly those in popular folklore. Cryptozoology, cryptids, are creatures like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, potentially tied to the wild man, as Dr. Stock and I discussed. Nessie, that would be the Loch Ness Monster. The Mokelemembe, Chupacabra, Wendigo. Those are all examples of these cryptids, these creatures of legend and myth. Now, some of those cryptids actually have their origins in textual tradition. I mentioned ancient Greece and Rome, and of course, there are all kinds of ancient monsters in the Greek and Roman traditions. Cerberus, three-headed dog. Harry Potter, that would be Fluffy. Cerberus actually guards the underworld in both the Greek and Roman traditions. He is only ferocious to those who trespass the gates of Hades. or the gates of Pluto, depending on whether we're talking the Greek or the Roman tradition. Cerberus does not go out and cause havoc. Cerberus does not go out and devour people. Not his job. Cerberus has a specific function. He is a guardian, a gatekeeper. He is, yes, a three-headed dog, but he serves specifically to guard the gates of the underworld. Other creatures like Hydra, which is the many-headed serpent snake, actually also had an origin and a purpose. And they only become famous when heroes end up being set a task where they have to kill them. But it's very often that these monsters, quote unquote, aren't really the problem. They have a task, they have a job, and they're in a specific place. For example, Medusa. Medusa was a beautiful young woman who was seduced or raped by a god. And a vengeful goddess transforms her into such a hideous creature with the body of a serpent, torso of a woman, face of a woman, and a head full of writhing snakes. And one glance from Medusa will turn you to stone. But that's not Medusa's fault. Medusa didn't do anything. Medusa is the victim of circumstance and the petty jealousy of the gods. But she also becomes one of these warnings, one of these portents. And in the story of Perseus, she is the creature he must defeat in order to save Andromeda. Now, other ancient monsters include cannibals. And of course, you might argue, yeah, cannibalism is about eating one of your own. That's literally the definition of cannibalism. But there are entities that eat men, people. And they've been called cannibals partly because they have humanoid aspects. One of the most famous, of course, from Greek tradition are the Cyclops. Now, the Cyclops are the children of Poseidon. In other texts, they are themselves Titans from the first round of creation and the children of Gaia. That's in Hesiod's Theogony from ancient Greece. And specifically in Hesiod's Theogony, the Cyclops are the three brothers, Brontes, Steropus, and Argus, who forge Zeus's thunderbolt. So they are craftsmen. Of course, in the Odyssey, Odysseus encounters Polyphemus, and he behaves fairly monstrously. Not Polyphemus, but Odysseus. And we only have Odysseus's account of his exchange and interaction with the Cyclops. And honestly, Homer doesn't make him look very good, because Odysseus is sitting there saying, well, these people are lawless, uncivilized. They don't dress the way we do. They don't eat the same kind of food. They don't live in houses. They don't have government. So they are monstrous. And he decides in his xenophobia, in his fear of foreigners and his arrogance, to do whatever he damn well pleases with the Cyclops, and it gets most of his men who are with him killed. And then he taunts them. After he blinds Polyphemus, whose home he has entered without permission, whose food he has stolen, whose gear he has stolen, he blinds him. And as the blind Polyphemus is running on the shore and all of his compatriots are shouting, who did this, who did this, who did this? Well, Odysseus had told him that his name was Nobody. So Polyphemus can only say, nobody. And then, of course, Odysseus can't help himself. He's on his ship. And as he gets far enough away from the shore, he shouts back, it wasn't nobody who did this. It was I, Odysseus of Ithaca. Well, I did mention that in this tradition, the Cyclops are the children of Poseidon. Poseidon is not best pleased that one of his offspring has been blinded so cruelly. So he then, since he's god of the ocean, makes Odysseus's journey back to Ithaca rather problematic. because Odysseus is a sailor. And in order to get home, he's got to sail on the ocean. So the story of the cannibals in the Odyssey and the Cyclops, even the witch Circe, and we'll get to witches in a minute, that story is actually more about the arrogance and the monstrous behavior of men than it is about the monstrous qualities of the Cyclops. Now, there are other creatures outside the Western European tradition. There's the ningyo, which is a human fish in Japanese. It's a Japanese creature whose appearance signals ill fortune. And the ningyo has the head of a woman and the body of a fish. You might actually think it's a variation of a mermaid. And in some respects, it is. I mean, even though mermaids have been romanticized in a lot of popular culture, and of course, they're lovely mermaids who do charity shows and who interact with aquariums, those modern mermaids are not these mermaids. These mermaids might very well lure men to their deaths. And in some cases, they are stand-ins for various aquatic perils for sailors, things that might harm them or beach their ships, like rocks. I mean, you get explanations for that also in the Odyssey. But mermaids who lure men to their death, also equated with sirens, again in the Odyssey, are basically warnings for the greed and the ignorance of the sailors on the sea. They are warnings to people to make sure that they take care and don't take unnecessary risks. There is an Old Norse version, the Hafru, that's a man snatching water sprite. And there's some parallel perhaps in Beowulf to Grendel's mother, who is referred to as a sea hag, but I don't personally think we should read sea hag as anything more than an epithet, because trust me, I have been called an awful lot of things in my life, and that doesn't make me any of them. And calling somebody a sea hag might just be an insult. But it's also possible that there is this association with these water creatures. Now, I bring up Beowulf because I keep saying we're going to have an episode on Beowulf, and we will. We will have an episode on Beowulf. But I want to talk about Beowulf in the context of monsters because thanks to J.R. Tolkien, in his public lecture and then the published essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, he talks about the monsters in this epic Old English poem that dates from about 1000-ish, give or take. He talks about them as the major artistic achievement of the Beowulf poet. Now, Beowulf as a text isn't just about monsters, but its central protagonist, Beowulf, has to fight 3 monsters in the arc of his narrative. Now, the first one is Grendel, and modern popular culture has not done Grendel any favors. In fact, modern popular culture hasn't done the poem Beowulf many favors. There's some decent versions, but there are others that are just awful. I'm looking at you, Beowulf 2000 with Christopher Lambert, which is steampunk, kind of medieval-esque, sort of mixed with a bit of M. Night Shyamalan and whoever the fuck knows what else, because that movie makes no sense to me. And I'm also looking at you, 2007 animated one, that has a lot of questionable directorial choices. One of which is making Grendel this essentially hybrid creature who looks like the mummy who hasn't been fully reconstituted. It's awful. And Grendel is often interpreted as this inhuman, monstrous creature. But the thing is, the text of Beowulf, the first time we hear about Grendel, the poet says, "Thus say Ellengeist, forlicha, braga, tholod, se they in this rumbad, that he dogora, ye chwam, drem ye hera, ludna in hela." Now, thus say Ellengeist, forth licha means then went forth an Ellengeist. Now, the word Ellengeist is a compound, it's a kenning. And if you take its two halves, Ellen and Geist, it can mean evil spirit, bold demon, fierce creature, firm apparition. If you put 7 translations of Beowulf next to each other, they are not all going to agree. And that's one of the things about Beowulf and about translation. And of course, how you first hear of Grendel affects how you interpret him. If you hear bold demon, you're going to think devil, demon, in the Christian sense. But you should not, because there is an Old English word for devil. It's Beowulf. There is an Old English word for demon. It is daemon. So we really shouldn't read Grendel necessarily as a demon in the Christian sense of the word. Ellengeist can simply mean solid apparition or firm apparition. And an apparition is something that appears, but you're not certain what it is. And that might describe Grendel. In fact, I have argued that it's possible that Grendel, because he moves at night and he kills men, and they never really get a glimpse of him, except in the text to say that a man and woman have been seen walking the fens. It is possible that Grendel is simply human, whose reputation has grown to monstrous proportions, and that he takes vengeance for a slight or an injury, or potentially for being exiled, and being exiled for the worst of crimes, murder. While other members of Hrothgar's Danish court, like Unferth, who also commit murder, and Unferth very famously, repeatedly, we are told, he killed his brothers. He was not kind to them in swordplay. It is possible that Grendel has been cast out of the society for a crime that others, like Unferth, are celebrated for, which would pinpoint the hypocrisy of that Danish society. And of course, Grendel's mother, Angleka, fearsome warrior or fiend, Mirwifa or Mirwife, a woman of the mere, just means a woman of the mere. Some people have interpreted mere wife as actual wife. It doesn't have to be a wife. It can simply be a woman. But this oldest English epic from about 1000-ish S, give or take, actually gives some great insight into the role that Myrkstappe, border walkers, like Grendel and his mother, play. And of course, they are set in contrast to the dragon. And the dragon is not a monster. The dragon is a cryptid. The dragon is a creature, an animal, who operates on instinct to guard his hoard, because that's what dragons do. They sniff out treasure, they find it, and when they do, they sit on it, and they roll in it, and they roll in that treasure, because that's what dragons do. Dragons do not need an explanation. Dragons just happen. And generally speaking, unless you are Smaug in The Hobbit, which is somewhat based on the Beowulf dragon and somewhat based on Fafnir, the shape-shifting dragon of Volsunga Saga, unless you're Smaug, you generally don't go out looking to torch people's towns. You only do it when a burglar comes in and steals from you. And that's what happens in Beowulf. But all of these literary iterations, these monsters, we don't really get a description of Grendel. There is no physical description beyond the fact that he has arms, 2 of them. Beowulf rips one of them off, and they hang it over the hall at Heorot, which pisses Mum off. And so Mama comes to get it. Wouldn't you? He has arms and he has claws. Now, there are all kinds of ways that can be interpreted too. She isn't really described at all. But the poet says, well, you know, women are much easier to fight, and so we don't really have to worry about women when they take up the sword. And then she proceeds to show up and practically cause as much havoc in one go as her son did, though she takes one life. One life for the life of her son. According to the tradition of blood feud, even though he refused to pay weregild for those he killed, even though you could argue, as they did in Old English tradition and in the legal codes, if you don't pay compensation, you are an outlaw, you are cast out, you are a mordvarger in Old Norse, a killer wolf, and you can be killed with impunity. Grendel's mother still takes vengeance for her son's death. Who wouldn't? And then when she takes the life of Ashra, who is Hrothgar's closest advisor, Beowulf has to go kill her. And she nearly kills him. So in that instance, the Meerwife is most definitely a more dangerous foe. And the dragon does kill Beowulf. And Beowulf kills the dragon. Because at the end of that epic, that is the appropriate and epic end for that hero. But those creatures aren't really identified. Some of the medieval ones that are, however, are the werewolves. And if you got a chance to listen to the additional material with my interview with Dr. Derek Newman-Still, who has, since we had that podcast, has now earned their PhD, and we're very proud of Derek for that. But if you heard that additional material, we talked all about werewolves. And of course, the idea of a man who transforms into a wolf goes all the way back to Ovid's Metamorphosis in the Roman tradition. From the character Lycan. Now, Lycan was one of those evil tyrants who does not welcome the god who shows up at his door. In fact, when the god shows up at his door, Lycan kills some hostages and tries to feed them to, well, Zeus. It's Jupiter in the Roman tradition, but Zeus, same god. Lycan tries to feed him hostages. He's murdered. You don't do that. That's bad form. And then he says he's going to murder the god in his sleep. Also bad form. Don't do that either. And ultimately what happens as Lycan runs from his hall, Jupiter, Zeus, takes his lightning bolts and throws them at Lycan's hall. The hall bursts into flames. And as Lycan is running away, he transforms into a wolf. Now, he transforms fully into a wolf, except that his eyes indicate that he retains his human consciousness. Now, that tradition of a werewolf, a garwolf in Norman, a bisclavere in Breton, that tradition influences the medieval werewolf stories. You have stories of Gerald of Wales who talk about the werewolves of Ossory, where you have human beings essentially in wolf skins, but they are wolves. You can peel it back, however. You have other stories like Volsunga Saga, the episode with Sigmund and Sinfjotli, when they are training in the woods to essentially get their revenge against King Siggeir, who killed Sigmund's father, Volsung. And Sigmund and Sinfjotli come upon these skins in the woods. And when they do, they kill the people who own the skins. That says something about them to begin with. They kill the people who own the skins, and then the magical skins adhere to them. And when those skins adhere to them, they are stuck in those wolf skins. And they decide to make a pact because they can talk to each other, as you do. And they say, okay, don't kill more than 7 men, because Sigmund is trying to train who he thinks is his nephew. It's actually his son, but that's a whole nother story. You got to read Volsunga Saga for that. And Sinfjotli, being bold and brash and stupid, decides to kill 11 men on his own, and he is grievously wounded. And Sigmund, hearing his yowls and his howls in wolf form, goes to him. He's so angry with Sinfjotli, bites his throat and almost kills him. But of course, Odin has other plans. So Odin sends them a sign. 2 weasels, both alike in dignity. One weasel bites the other weasel on his neck. The weasel is gravely wounded. And then the weasel takes a leaf and puts it on the other weasel's necks. And the other weasel hops up, perfectly healed. And from that, Sigmund, in wolf form, realizes that he needs to find that same kind of leaf and then apply it to Sinfjotli and heal him. And he does, because that's what happens when Odin gets involved. And Odin gets involved. So, at that point, when the wolf skins come off, Sigmund is actually horrified. And he burns those wolf skins and says, I bade the trolls take them. And he does that because he recognizes that they were too savage to start with. And the wolfskins simply gave them the means by which they can enact their savagery without detection. And so he decides to burn those wolfskins. Now, that's Volsunga Saga. A contemporary text, or actually a little earlier, is Marie de France's Bisclaveret. Now, Bisclaveret, and in fact, I'm going to teach Bisclaveret to my students this week because it's October, and we do. This story is about a happily married couple. And these people love each other. She tells us how much they love each other, but the husband is gone for 3 days a week. 3 days a week. And the wife has no idea where he is. And finally, she works up the courage to say to him, my love, I hate to ask you this because I fear your anger more than anything. That is an important point. I fear your anger more than anything. But she asks him, where do you go 3 days a week? Are you having an affair? And he's like, I can't tell you. I can't tell you anything but that. I just can't tell you that. I can't because I'll lose your love and you'll hate me. And it'll be awful. I'll lose everything. And she's like, oh, well, I really do need to know because you disappear. I mean, he's a baron. He's neglecting his lands. He's neglecting his people. And he's certainly neglecting his wife. I mean, what would you do if your spouse, partner, buggered off for 3 days a week without any kind of explanation? You'd ask too. And she pushes him. She pressures him. And he finally relents and says, I become a werewolf? And her thought is, oh, how does that happen? And he explains that he takes his clothes off and he puts them under a rock by a tree on the edge of the forest next to a church. And he says, well, if I don't have my clothes, I'll stay a wolf. And she's thinking, holy crap, I'm married to a wolf. This is a problem. And I have recently argued in an article titled Sympathy for the Werewolf's Wife. I've argued that one of the thoughts running through her head is, I have sex with this man who becomes a werewolf. That's bestiality. And that is not allowed, nor is it cool. And if we have children, that's going to lead to all kinds of problems, hybrid babies and all. Now, that's what I argue in the article. The text very clearly says she's very afraid of him. She's afraid of him before she even asks, and now she is terrified for her life, and she is trying to figure out how to get out of this marriage. It is the 12th century. There is no divorce. She enlists the help of a knight who's been in love with her for years, and she's never given him any encouragement. She is not an adulteress, not by choice, and she only becomes one by necessity, because she gets that knight to help her hide her husband's clothes, and then he stays a wolf. We don't know for certain in this text whether or not the magic is in the clothes. We don't know if the clothes automatically transform him. When he gets them back at the end, he won't put them on until he's in private. He's a modest little werewolf, and he doesn't want to be naked in front of people. That's fair. But it's not the clothes that automatically transform him. And the implication is he has to transform back into a man, a naked man. He's got to transform back into a man to put those clothes on. She takes the clothes. He's a wolf for a year. And at one point, the king is in the woods. He's gone hunting. He comes upon this wolf. He's about to kill him. And then he's like, oh, the wolf is licking my foot. Because the wolf knows what side his bread is buttered on. And the wolf is licking his foot, and the wise man says, oh, this is not your average wolf. Let's take him back. And the wolf becomes basically the king's lapdog, even sleeps on his bed. You may read into that whatever you like. And eventually, the wife and her new husband come to court. And the werewolf attacks the husband, the knight, and mauls his wife, rips off her nose. Now, he's not just going snip, he is ripping off a large portion of her face. And the king thinking, oh, well, my wolf has never done this before. Clearly, he's never been violent before. So it's not the wolf's fault. The wolf's not violent. The wife must have done something. So he subjects the wife, whose nose has just been ripped off, he subjects her to torture. And under torture, which was illegal in England, which is where this text was produced in the 12th century, the king employs torture, and under torture, she confesses about the clothes. And the clothes are returned, and the noseless, tortured wife is exiled. She is blamed for having sought a way out of a marriage that was abusive, that was violent. And of course, my students often say, well, but he never hurt her before. No. People who are violent often don't. They are never violent until they are. And then that violence, when they unleash it, often has disastrous consequences. Just because somebody does not look like an abuser, just because they don't act like an abuser to everybody else, does not mean that they are not an abuser. Just because they are not always violent, just because they haven't been violent before, does not mean that they cannot be violent. Because once they are, they are. And in Bisclaveret, he hasn't been violent until he is. And you can insert abuser, rapist for werewolf. And it's entirely likely that Marie de France's 12th century story is not meant to be taken at face value, criticizing the wife for being unfaithful, but perhaps as a critique and a condemnation of that circle, that court, that welcomes the werewolf that causes such violence back into their fold because he's one of them. Their silence is one of complicitness, complicity. Theirs is the silence of consent. And in fact, they're not even silent. They welcome him back with open arms. You have a court that takes back into the fold a man who commits hideous violence against his wife. But then he serves a king who's willing to employ torture against a woman who's already been punished, and then exile her. And in a mark of that supposed betrayal, all of her female children are born noseless. But you could equally argue that Marie is criticizing that kind of homosocial approbation that accepts abusers and violent people back into the fold without punishment simply because they are one of their own. Werewolves in medieval stories have a lot of lessons to teach. In some cases, the werewolf is not violent to start with. And in some cases, the werewolf actually ends up not really being all that violent at all. But in many of the medieval werewolf stories, the werewolf is violent not because they're a wolf, but because of the human mind that still exists in wolf form. Much like Lycan, the medieval werewolves retain their capacity for human thought, and it is the capacity for human thought that makes them violent and monstrous. Now, in other traditions, you have animals that transform from animal into humans in order to lure people to their death. In South African traditions, you've got the were animals like the hyena, the were hyenas and the were lions. In those cases, those are animals that transform into humans and do it in order to murder other humans. But it is basically about putting on that human form when their real nature is the animal form. And in a lot of those cases, those stories of the were-lions are, and the were-hyenas especially, are part of ritual coming of age dances. They are part of all kinds of ritual dances done with masks and music and drums and food, and it's all part of a ritual coming of age, where, of course, it's the young man, generally, who has to defend his people against these were-creatures. Now, of course, in modern cinema, we are very sympathetic to werewolves. We love our werewolves. Our werewolves are amazing. And in fact, the modern cinematic werewolves are sympathetic because they don't retain their human consciousness for the most part. In most cases, it's good people bitten by a wolf. Don't stray off the path ever. And if you're in a pub in Yorkshire and they all look at you funny, find a hotel. But all of those cinematic werewolves, like the Wolfman or American Werewolf in London, and even Being Human, those stories are about people who are bitten by a wolf and who transform against their will and who no longer know what they're doing once they transform. Those werewolves are very different, and they're partly why we have so much sympathy for werewolves. Now, another form of quote-unquote monster, ghosts. And of course, ghosts exist in every tradition all over the world. There are stories of apparitions, of spirits, of haunts, of haints that visit the living. They're either trapped souls, they either mark violence done, or in some cases, they are there to warn people. Old English, ghast, spirit, soul. Long tradition of these undead spirits. Now, before the Catholic Church codified purgatory in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, you either went to heaven or you went to hell. And of course, if you weren't Christian, there's a whole kind of underworld kind of thing. And everybody who's dead goes there. You might get a nicer bit if you are special, like the Elysium Fields, and you might get a worse bit if you're really bad, like Prometheus, and you end up in Tartarus. But for the most part, the underworld's the underworld. It's Dante's Inferno, completed about 1307, that actually gives us the structure that we think of for hell, those 9 circles of hell. But of course, in the Paradiso and the Purgatorio, he tells of the other places for the dead. And because Purgatorio was now a thing, thanks to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, now you have to really give it shape. And that's what Dante did. Ghosts were believed to be souls trapped in purgatory or trapped possibly on the liminal plane between the different worlds. If you go from Hamlet, his father says he's in purgatory where his soul is tormented, and he exhorts Hamlet, remember me, remember me, remember me, all to urge him to vengeance, which really doesn't end well for Hamlet. But in medieval texts, there are all kinds of different undead. There are revenants, the Hogbuil, which is, the Hogbuil is a mound dweller, or a Draugr, which is a revenant. Then there's the Atraganger, which means again walker. All of those are Old Norse terms specifically for these variations of the undead. They're not ghosts because they are solid. But they are entities that have died and won't stay dead. Grettir Saga. Kar the Old is a Hagbui that haunts his own grave and the surrounding island. Glaumr is a Draugr who haunts a hall. And in fact, Grettir Saga, there is this whole fight between Grettir and Glaumr, which is very close to Grendel and Beowulf. And some people have argued that Grendel could be read perhaps as a Draugr. It's possible. There are other Old Norse Icelandic sagas, like the Hervarar saga, Hreidriks. You have the zombified Angantyr in that one. And then you've got Hromundur saga, Gripsonur. Now, in Gripsonur, Thrain is a Draugr. There are all kinds of Draugrs because there are all kinds of burial mounds. And there was a certain fear of the undead. And of course, those kind of revenants certainly show up in Game of Thrones as the White Walkers. In other traditions, you have the undead zombies, as in Haitian voodoo, modern cinema. Now, in Haitian voodoo, the idea of the zombie is somebody whose soul is controlled by a bokor, and the bokor casts a spell and traps that person's soul. And in some cases, they are given a zombie powder, serpent of the rainbow, and that powder will paralyze them because it has fugu fish or the tetrodotoxin in it that essentially makes it look like somebody is dead even though they're not. And then they bury the body, and the bokor will dig them up and then convince them that that person is enslaved to them. Now, that is not the same as modern zombies. Brains, brains. We have George Romero to thank for those. That the idea of the walking undead, however, does go back to the Revenant tradition. It also goes back to the tradition of the three living and the three dead. That vision of, as I am now, so will you be. That living bodies will decay into death. Now, of course, one of the more famous ones is the undead vampires. And of course, vampires are sexy. But you know, there's no actual medieval stories about vampires. All the medieval stories about the undead, they are not nice undead. They are not pretty undead. They are not undead that you're going to let close enough for them to bite you on the neck. That is not the medieval undead. Vampires are a largely folkloric entity. And they come from all kinds of areas in Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, even in Greek, the Vrykolakas, in Albanian, the Striga, but the Striga can also be a witch. You have the Strigoi in Romanian, again, can also be a witch, but also vampire. In French, it's vampire. In Bulgarian and Macedonian, also vampire. In Turkish, it's the ubir or the obir. In Bosnian, it's vampire. And those are entities sometimes revenant-like, sometimes not so nice, but they also gave rise to the 19th century fascination with the vampire, based on the demented ravings of a sexually repressed Irishman named Bram Stoker, who in his book Dracula from 1897, creates the entity of Dracula based on Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, who was a real person, 15th century Wallachian prince, who actually just beat back the Turks from his homeland. He did some pretty awful things, but he mostly did them to dead bodies. Whether he was actually a vampire or not, probably not. But Bram Stoker thought that makes a great story. Bram Stoker was not the first 19th century vampire story, however. Bram Stoker adapted his vampire from earlier texts like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla from 1872, which is about a woman vampire who preys on other women. But praise is subjective because there's every possibility in Carmilla that Laura, the supposed victim, that really what she experienced with Carmilla was love, attachment, and sexual desire, and fulfillment. And that when Carmilla is killed by the men in Laura's life and they say she's a vampire, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. Maybe that text is simply an indictment of 19th century homophobia that would deny people entities that they love. Regardless, Carmilla is a very famous vampire story. Before that, in the early 19th century, you get all kinds of penny dreadfuls, Varney the Vampire. And they all come from John Polidori's book, The Vampire from 1818, written at the same time that Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein, which is a much better book. Frankenstein, much better than Polidori's Vampire. Polidori's Vampire, in all honesty, is pretty awful. But that 19th century vampire is where we get our sexy modern vampires from. Our Lestats, our Louis, even our Damons and Stephans. Team Damon. Stefan is very whiny. I have to say that. Stefan is very whiny. Also, we get the origin stories, the originals. You get your Klaus, you get your Elijah. I am also Team Elijah. I can't help it. I love these modern vampire stories. But those modern vampire stories owe far more to the 19th century than they do to the Middle Ages. Now, part and parcel of some of these things, you get witches. There, as I said, you've got the Odyssey, Circe. The word witch in Old English is Wicca. So the modern pagan religious tradition, Wicca, comes from the word witch. And there are other famous witches. Morgan Le Fay. Well, Morgan Le Fay is a sorceress. She knows spells. And her name means Morgan of the Fay, of the fairy, which implies otherworldly. And when I say fairy, think Galadriel, not Tinkerbell. Morgan Le Fay is a sorceress. She is a skilled enchantress. And in some medieval texts, she's a bad guy, but very often she's not. Her job is to try and get her brother Arthur, who's a bit thick at times, to actually wake up, pay attention to the adultery that's happening under his nose between Lancelot and Guinevere, and do something about it. Because it's going to destroy his kingdom, which it does. Morgan was right. Morgan gets demonized in a lot of modern popular culture versions, but really, as a sorceress and an enchantress, she is not an evil character in a lot of the medieval texts. In fact, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, she was referred to as Morgan the Goddess. Now, there's some association between alewives and witches, and of course, in the episode with Noel Phillips, Dr. Phillips said, nope, not true, which crushes me a little bit. I like that association. You do really have this fear of witchcraft that starts in the 15th century with the publication of the Malus Maleficarium, which is the Hammer of Witches by Heinrich Cranmer in 1487. Now, that text is all about how to spot a witch, extra fingers, moles, consorting with black cats. I don't know what you mean. But part of that is the cultural transition as Christianity was starting to fracture between Catholic and Protestant. Now, the Protestant Reformation is not until 1517, but the identification of witches as consorting with the devil isn't really any earlier than 1487 either. Most witches were women who engaged in healing and in herbal lore and were essentially midwives or local doctors. Women who are independent, women who lived on their own, might be branded witches. But really, the witch trials that most people think of are post-Reformation. Because if people were going to be burned at the stake in the Middle Ages, it was likely that they would be burned at the stake for heresy, not witchcraft. Though there were witch trials in the Middle Ages, they were just not nearly as widespread as most people think. And not all witches were women. Some men were accused of witchcraft too. But the biggest chunk of the witch trials and the association of witches with evil, that happens with the publication of Malus Maleficarium. And of course, that takes on all different dimensions. But you have traditions and folklore all over the world, like the Baba Yaga. She is a witch-like creature, but she's not necessarily bad. She's not necessarily good. It all kind of depends on you. You have traditions like the Perchta, who accompany Krampus. Now, some of these witches are not associated with the Halloween season at all. In fact, many of these entities are not. Giants. We talked about giants, myself and Dr. Stock. And of course, giants can be horrible. They can be awful. They can be creepy. They can be cannibalistic. They can rape women to death, or they can be kind of benevolent. It just depends. When we get to something like Frankenstein, though, he is rather large. And I will point out that Frankenstein in the title refers to the doctor, not the creature. And I refuse to call Victor Frankenstein's creation a monster. Because if he is a monster, so is Victor. And arguably, Victor is more monstrous because Victor creates that life without taking any responsibility for it. And in fact, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, is more an indictment of scientific irresponsibility and individual responsibility than it is of anything else. In the novel, the creature speaks. The creature learns to read. Paradise Lost, and he is obsessed, and rightly so, with the idea and the quote from Book 10. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? I didn't ask you to make me, but you did. And if I am flawed because you made me that way. That is what Frankenstein's creation says to him. In fact, Victor says specifically in terms of the description of him, how can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. If he's a monster, if he's hideous, it's because Victor made him that way. So, Frankenstein, as a monster, is certainly important. He only takes revenge when Victor abandons him. Victor abandons him to society, and society's first response to that creature when they see that creature saving a girl from drowning, her father shoots him. And then society continues to act monstrously to both the creature and its other members. Her novel is not an indictment of the creation, but of the creator, who was so concerned about whether he could, he never stopped to think whether he should. Now, all of that is to say that monsters, as we think about them, and of course it's October, we're going to watch horror movies. My favorite, Halloween, the original, Mike Myers, awesome. All of those monsters say something about us. Monsters are about the society that creates them. Monsters are our omens, our warnings, our portents, but they are also reflections of our best and our worst traits. Monsters are us, and we are monsters. Whatever we decide is monsters. When we demonize other people, when we call them names, when we decide that somebody is less than human and we brand them something else, that is a reflection on us, not them. Our monsters are meant to keep us from being monstrous. Halloween monsters, when you dress up and go house to house, are actually meant to protect you. They're meant to essentially teach you how to be generous, be hospitable. Monstrosity is in the eye of the beholder. Monstrous behavior is something you can control. And all of these monsters, from the ancient monsters of the Greek and Roman tradition, all the way back to Gilgamesh in the Sumerian, with Humbaba, who's not really a monster, and arguably Gilgamesh is far more monstrous for killing him than Humbaba ever was for guarding his cedar forest as he was supposed to do, because that was his job. In many monster stories, the real monster, or the one who behaves the worst, is the human, not the monster. They are the mirror, and we project our fears, our hatred, our prejudices, our angst, our anxiety, our desires onto them. So this Halloween, if you think Halloween is about evil, it's not. It's about rebirth. It's about the beginning of a new year. It's about venerating the dead. It's about paying attention to those who've passed before. It's about showing reverence for life that ends so that we may better appreciate the life we live. So venerate those monsters. Celebrate Halloween. Celebrate the dead who've gone before, and celebrate this life that we have. Because the veil will be thin, and the wall between the underworld and this one will diminish, and the spirits of the underworld will walk the earth. The last thing you want to do That wall between the world grows thin. The spirits of the underworld walk the earth. The last thing you want to do is piss them off. So, I wish you all a blessed Samhain and a very happy Halloween. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.